Hello, everyone. Welcome back to A Fictional Escapist. My name is Chris, and today we are interviewing the one and only Mr. Mark Holloway, author of the Aspect series. The most recent installment came out on July 10th, I want to say, of 2023, so just last month. Hey, Abel, welcome in. Yes, you do need to start the series. It's very good. I'm sure that Mark will also tell you that it is quite good, and we would love for you to start the series. But, Mark, we're going to kick it off. Tell us a little bit about yourself, give us an introduction, and when you realized you wanted to be a writer.
Yeah. Hi, everybody, and thanks for having me on. I'm Mark Holloway, author of the Aspect series, and I'm an indie fantasy author or self-published, whichever one you prefer. Um, when I want to be an author? I've kind of been writing since I was a child, to be honest, but not very good and kind of very sporadically. So I think I've always kind of had a tendency to creative writing, and I think I really started to really enjoy creative writing when I was kind of late teenager, um, and starting to go into college and then university because my choices were very kind of my education choices were very kind of logical and scientific. I quite appreciated having something that was completely on the flip of that, like creative writing. And I read a lot of fantasy as a kid, exclusively fantasy as a kid because I was a massive nerd and still am. So I think naturally, whenever you read like that, when you read fantasy like that and you grow up with it, you have a tendency to kind of think about what it would be to write your own books and kind of develop your own stories just from osmosis of absorbing various different fantasy books. So I think it's kind of always been in the background. It's never something I really thought about doing because after university, I went straight into kind of a career which is very scientific, very rigorous, very logical. So it's the complete opposite of like my day job. And then a couple of years ago, I had a story in my head that it felt like it was a good story. So I thought it'd be good to try and get it down on paper, and then I found a writing group, etc., etc. So there's this very non-answer, unfortunately, but it's kind of a continuous process, and it just slowly became more and more real as time went on.
That's awesome, and you can see little bits of the scientific background come through in your writing and in the aspect there. So that leads me to a big congratulations on Chaos Risen. So we've now completed the first volume of the aspect, and we'll get to more about that a little bit later on what's next for you now that that first volume is complete. But just for those of us who may not be familiar, or the audience that may not be familiar with the work of the aspect, can you give us a bit of an introduction to the body of work that has come from you?
Yeah, sure. So the aspect is a series of books. It's going to be multi-series series of books, but primarily it's kind of written as a love letter to a certain genre of fantasy, a very specific genre of fantasy, which is coming of age fantasy. So if like me, you're a massive nerd and you've read a lot of fantasy as a kid, you will have come across kind of young adult coming of age stories, which they always tend to have quite a positive, hopeful note to them. But then, obviously, in fantasy, there are other flavors of coming of age stories, and I'm thinking mostly of like Robin Hobb-esque coming of age fantasy, where they focus on a character who starts off quite young, and we watch them grow. But instead of that kind of hopeful note, it's a little bit more realistic in terms of the way that a child and raised in a sheltered life, who's then thrust into responsibility way beyond what you'd normally expect, can be treated by the world around them and their attitude, and how they react to that. So the Souls aspect came from writing a love letter to that sort of genre, where you could start off with a very cozy coming of age traditional fantasy, but then it twists into a much darker fantasy, in the same way that from childhood, you can live a very sheltered life. And then if you give that child a lot of responsibility in the way that a lot of those coming of age fantasies do, how the world then reacts to that, to essentially a child coming in and trying to disrupt things. So it's generally it's a love letter to that. And then aside from that, the whole series, this first volume of The Aspect is around revenge and the way that characters interface and react and pursue revenge. And each three of the books kind of is themed around that and themed around one particular character and the way that they pursue that revenge. So it's a coming of age story. It features kind of a lot of the first book features a lot of the kind of classic tropes in a coming of age fantasy with a magic academy, friendship groups, etc. But it also twists quite dark and then continues on dark. So fair warning that if you're after a cozy fantasy, it's maybe you'll enjoy the first half of the Souls Aspect, but the rest of it does go quite dark. And fair warning.
And confirm. When I read the first book, I was like, oh, this is really nice. Whoa.
Yeah, exactly.
That last sort of, so about 3/4 mark, I was like, yeah, Callum's really nice. This is such a lovely story. Damn, man. It just twisted on us. Esme says, good morning. Thought I'd pop in for a minute to make myself feel even worse for not having continued this series yet. Yes, Esme, for shame.
Yeah.
Are you up to book 2? I know you've read the first one. All right. So Abel's come in and said, elevator pitch for the entire series. What have you got? Have you got a 2-minute elevator pitch?
Oh god, I'm terrible at this. I'm really bad at like single pitches. A healer has to learn how to become a killer after being trained by an empire to hunt and kill his own people. Is the shortest possible elevator pitch I can give you without giving any spoilers. Yeah.
I will definitely say that is what sold me on the first book, a healer turned killer. And I was like, I'm in for whatever this is. And it did not disappoint. We had Esme saying, heck yes, lure us in with the coziness, then go dark and deliver emotional damage.
Yeah. Those anglerfishes with like the little dangly
yeah
on them. Yeah, that's if you want, that's a better angler pitch. Is my book is an anglerfish. That's it, and that's all the context I'm going to give you.
Would you say it goes full grimdark?
No, and I think there is a difference between dark fantasy and grimdark, in that it's not relentlessly, it's not relentlessly dark, and it's not kind of. It's dark, I think, in a realistic way, in that, if you have a power structure set up already that's already established, and then you have a child come in trying to disrupt that, the consequences are realistic, and they are, it doesn't have any plot armor at all. So it's more, I would say, in the A Song of Ice and Fire-esque darkness, which again, I don't think is grimdark, because there are hopeful elements to that, and it's more epic fantasy, dark fantasy, rather than pure, Prince of Thorns, grimdark.
I've not read Prince of Thorns yet. I've not had the pleasure of that grimdark experience. Thank God. All right. I'm the same as May. Hearing about how dark something gets, I'm like, yeah, let's just see where that goes. I don't know what that says about me either, but I feel like you and I are the same person at this point. Hey, Natalie, welcome in. I agree that plot twist was something, and I'm sure Mark trying to figure out which one. He's thrown at us.
I know which one. One of my favorite things is when someone picks up one of my books and then I get a DM and I can pinpoint exactly where they are in my story, because the DM is always some flavor of "oh my god" or "how could you" or "I am crying." So. Yeah, I know exactly. I won't apologize.
Did I send you a message? I can't remember.
I think you did. Yeah,
I think I did at the end of the third one, and I was like, I see what you did.
Yeah,
so thanks so much for that. Hob can destroy me emotionally, but it is not grimdark. Now I've heard a lot about Hob, but I DNF'd book 2. I will give it another go. I promise.
Yeah, the first I'm talking. I probably shouldn't be talking about other people's books, but I love Robin Harper's books, and the first trilogy, I think it can be rough for people to get into. It is kind of the first trilogy is kind of. I don't know exactly when it was released. I think it was in the 1990s, and it feels like it was in the 1990s. It's a great series, but it's very slow, and also it doesn't set you up. if you're going in and wanting like a fast-paced assassin tale, which is kind of what the tagline for that book is, it's not that. It's a very slow-paced character burn, and you have to have a lot of patience with Fitz, unfortunately. But
I
it's
just couldn't stand Fitz. That's where I
yeah.
fell short.
The tough thing is that in the first trilogy he's very young, and so he makes a lot of silly young person mistakes, which is great because it's very realistic. But if you don't want to read that, then that's tough.
I have heard Live Ships. I'm going to give Live Ships a go, I promise. Probably in 2025. Abel, it's a no spoiler discussion. We won't be having any spoilers here, so don't worry. All right, before we jump on the next questions, we've got the last one from the audience by Esme. What are your favorite types of reader reactions to get?
So the majority of reactions I get are positive, negative ones, I would say, which is where a reader comes in and they say that I've had a massive negative reaction to reading this, where it's like it's hit me really hard, it's ruined my day, stuff like that. I don't mean that to say I really enjoy ruining readers' days, but I think anywhere where any writer can cause any sort of kind of visceral reaction in somebody, good, positive, or negative, I think it is great. And I think what I try and do with the aspect is have periods where there are really nice stuff that's happening and there's positive stuff that's happening, but then there are also dark things that happening. And I think it's that juxtaposition which I think does hit readers quite hard sometimes. But yeah, those types of reactions are, they're great. And I've had a lot of them for Chaos Risen, which has been great as well. That's how I'm, I have a little tally chart, like readers' days I've ruined. And then I can...
There's a whiteboard on your wall being like...
Yeah, exactly.
That's one for Mark.
Yeah, exactly.
Amazing. All right, well, each book in this series, we sort of touched on it a little bit before, but they differ so much from one another. So the Souls aspect, as we were saying, was quite character driven. It really does give you that coming of age feeling. It is a little bit soft, I would say, in my opinion, in terms of the elements that are there. It doesn't really build until book 2 when we come into that dark, very plot focused storyline. And then the third book differs again, where we have a good mix of both. So we have a lot of character because you've built them up so well over the first 2 books, but we also are continuing that plot and those darker undertones that you have there. Was this done on purpose? And can you tell us a little bit about why you approach the series in this way?
It was 100% done on purpose. And I think it's a natural reaction to the way that the books are themed and the way that the books are set up. So like I said, the first book is kind of written as a true love letter to that coming of age fantasy. And I think it makes sense, particularly with the way that it's structured, to have it as very blinkered, character-driven story where we are only focused on Callum, the main character, who is a POV. And it's also first-person perspective. So it's naturally very close narrative. And he is also at that age where there's a lot of transition going on in the way he sees the world and the way that he experiences the world. And it's, in my opinion, it's better for that character and that story to be, as character driven as possible, because we get to see this plot outside of Callum's perspective, which he has to react to without necessarily seeing everything that's led up into it. And I think it's a much more interesting story if we get it like that. And a lot of the more plotty elements of that book are in the subtext of the book, or in the history of the book, because obviously the book is set after a tumultuous war, and so there's a lot of subtext that goes along with the way that characters react to each other from different countries, etc. So that first book was it was written to be much slower, character-driven story, so that we can really get to understand Callum, because he is the focal point for the Aspect series. The second book, it was definitely that definitely needed to be a lot more plot-driven. The first reason for that is kind of just pragmatically, I didn't want the book to suffer from middle book syndrome, where everything kind of slows down and everyone takes a breather and reacts to what happened in the first book. And really, the reason why I needed to be quick is that the stuff that happens at the end of the first book, it needed to feel justified, and it needed to feel kind of kinetic in the way that the characters then react to it, for me to feel happy with what happened in the end of the first book. So But to be fair, in the second book, we introduce a new POV, and their POV, I think, is quite character. It remains quite character driven, and they are a bit slower, just from the nature of them being a new character POV. So there's kind of although it's only a minor feature in that second book. So there is there's a thread that carries through from the first book, but it does remain a lot more plot driven. And then in the third book, as you said, it was more of a balance. And again, pragmatically, that's there so that readers who really enjoyed the character-driven nature of the first book have something to come home to with the third book. But also, I think it makes sense, again, with the story this time. Instead of it being narratively blinkered, the story itself focuses on elements that blinker the world a little bit. No spoilers for what that is, but it blinkers the world a little bit. So, while the second book opens everything up and we explore the world a lot more, the third book brings that right back down again. And so with everything that happens in the third book, which is new and novel, it's best, I think, to experience that directly with the characters and slow things down with character-driven exploration. But again, there is an awful lot of plot that happens in the third book, which then has to carry through towards the end of this first volume.
Now that you mentioning about the slower character that comes into the second book, yeah, I can see that. Did not put that together prior, but yes, it was a very slow, character-driven element for that story. Whilst there was a lot of that plot happening around us. Hey Cam, welcome in. Negative reviews are wild. At least they cared enough to let it get to them.
Yeah. So clarification. I don't mean people being like, "This book's terrible. It made me cry. I hated it. 1 star." To be fair, most of the people, in fact, all of the people who have a negative reaction, as in, get upset or ruins their day, they do leave very positive reviews, which I'm very grateful for. Yeah, but I agree. Yeah, generally.
Would you like to address this comment, Mark? Is this a true fact?
Yeah, it's true. I've had Carl specifically asked me once. He came into my DMs and said to me, were you kicked in the head as a child by a horse? Which I thought is just, I want to put that on my book somewhere as a quote, because it's the funniest reader reaction I've ever had. I haven't, but I understand where that concern came from.
So just to clear that up, Carl, Mark was not kicked in the head as a child. You know those books that have like obnoxiously long tributes or like little blurbs in the front of them? I feel like that would fit really well.
It would do, yeah.
In the front of the book.
Just zero context. Just were you kicked in the head as a child by a horse, Carl?
100%. All right, so we've talked a little bit about character work. Our main character, Kellum, again, no spoilers, but Kellum is the main protagonist, and he, throughout the series, is known as both a hero and a butcher in various stages of his life. Now, me as a reader and a lot of other readers out there do love a grey character. What was it like for you as the author exploring both sides of the personality within the same person?
I think that's what makes Kellum a really interesting character, I think. And I think, when I mentioned at the start that I had a story in my head that I wanted to write, it all came from the concept of a character who, one side, not him, but one side of the characters would see him as a morally good character. And, without any issue at all, if you looked at the perspective of other characters in the story, they would see him as, morally evil kind of character. And I know that's not something that's particularly new, but I think there's a lot in the space that could be done with that kind of character that not necessarily has been done before. So the whole concept of the story came from Kellum, centered around the story as this character who has these really tough decisions that he has to make. He himself doesn't see, I don't think it's fair to say, he himself doesn't see himself as a morally good or morally pure character. I think he's quite pragmatic, which comes from the fact that he is a healer, and that him being a healer feeds into this kind of morally grey characteristic as well, because it's, I kind of characterize him a little bit as like as a surgeon, where if you have a wound or you have a festering wound, then it's the surgeon's responsibility to cut away and remove the parts which are no longer viable. And if you've ever met a surgeon or speak to surgeons, you will know that sometimes they can be a little bit abrupt in the way that they speak to people, or very pragmatic is probably the best and most polite way of referring to surgeons. And it's that kind of attitude which feeds into Callum's character specifically. But yeah, 100%. If you're in the Kasari side, which is Callum's country, they will see him as a morally good kind of character. But if you were on the Vinaruda side, which is the bordering country, they absolutely wouldn't. And one of the nice things that's happened with Callum's character as we've gone along is there's been a timeline, the way that Callum views himself and the way that Callum views his own actions and the way that people react to his moral character as well, and the way that they use him as a figurehead, either as a negative figurehead or as a positive figurehead. So there's a lot that goes into it. And I just prefer morally great characters generally. I have issue with absolute evil and I have issue with absolute good in stories. It makes me concerned. I prefer all my characters to be grey to some degree.
Yeah, I think Cam really hit the nail on the head there. Grey is more realistic. It's a matter of perspective from where you are in terms of that person's life. And I think as humans, most of us are pretty morally grey.
Oh yeah, 100.
Anyway,
I'm absolutely morally grey. Yeah.
Yeah.
If you polled 100 people, they'd probably find someone who thought I was, morally evil.
It's the D&D square with all the
different
exactly that you can be. Yeah. I'm the same, Heather. A 1-star review makes me go, maybe I'll enjoy that. And there's been times where I picked up a book from a 1-star review and I've enjoyed it. So I guess that's all a matter of perspective as well. The reading is subjective. Heather also says, I love when a writer has me tip every thought about a character on its head. Yeah, absolutely. When you think you know, but you don't know. And the author just throws a spanner in the works. I love that as well. You've got quite a few strong characters in the Aspect series. I want to touch, again, non-spoiler for people in the audience there, is your books were quietly inclusive, and something that I really loved about the series is it was quietly inclusive. It wasn't overt, it wasn't in anyone's face, but you had very normative roles within the world. So I was taken back by the character who was introduced in book 2 named Barn. So I just want to, and if I'm pronouncing that wrong, correct me. Can you tell us a little bit about her character, how she came to be, and the way that she was represented in the books? Because I was blown away by it.
Pronunciation is perfect. Yeah, Ban. I call it. I go between the two. Quiet inclusivity. Yeah, it's a good way of describing it. Actually, as a straight cis het white male, I do think it's important to have inclusivity in fantasy books. I don't think there's any particular reason not to have inclusivity in the book unless it's a particular plot point. And I kind of think personally, I didn't want to make any sort of plot points around any of the inclusive characters because I think there's enough of that already in fantasy. And my feeling is that generally it's probably better just to have it as the characters exist. It's just part of who those characters are, and it doesn't need to be an actual plot point for once. It kind of can just be who they are as characters. Ban was really interesting because again, the way characters come to me, I know generally how the story needs to go and where the arc needs to go, and then the character kind of comes from the arc. And kind of when I was first thinking about Ban as a character, so she is a younger female character that's introduced in the second book. She's around 13, 14 years old, and she's kind of there to be an almost reflection to the main character in the story, and the way her story progresses, or not progresses, starts out. So she has very similar starts in life to Callum, but one of the things about Ban as part of her character that I knew almost immediately was that she was Ace Arrow, and it's not one of those things where it's kind of really discussed in the book, other than the context is there in the subtext and in the dialogue. And I think fantasy's got a lot better with that sort of quiet inclusivity. I don't think there are that many books that I've read, certainly, that have Ace Arrow characters in them. And when I was coming up with Ban as a character, it kind of, her character in the way that she was, it felt to me that she was Ace Arrow. The tricky thing with that, and me not wanting to have any sort of plot points, I really did want to have that kind of, whenever you have an Ace Arrow character, to have that plot point where a character comes up and says, "Oh, I'm interested in you," and then there has to be the dialogue that always happens, and it feels like it always happens whenever there was an Ace Arrow character, and I really didn't want that. So instead, it's kind of more in the subtext of the story. The really nice thing though is that I've had readers who have come to me after reading book 2 and or book 3, and they've come to me and asked about Ban, whether she was Ace Arrow or not. So hopefully, because what I don't want it to be, I don't want to do that thing that some authors do where they kind of put hints here and there, but they don't really commit to it because they're afraid of what people would say if it was 2 of her, and then as it's become, as the world's become more progressive, they can go, actually this character was this or this character was that. No, I think it, if you're going to put inclusive characters in there, it needs to be inclusive enough for people to read it to know. So that is the balance that needs to be had with that sort of quiet inclusivity. But for me, at least, the reaction I've had is that what's in there is enough at the moment for people to understand, which is, it's really great. I think the other thing, that kind of goes along with that, it's not directly related, but something I've been thinking about recently, and it got a lot of it went into the writing and the world building of the Aspect series, is traditionally sometimes in fantasy, especially the older fantasy in the 1990s, there can be a lot of kind of female violence or sexual assault, sexual harassment, and that kind of stuff in fantasy. I think, generally it depends on the way that the world has been built. And if it's built on a very traditional kind of Western medieval setting where there were those power imbalances between men and women were treated like objects for marriages and political pawns and stuff, then it kind of makes sense why that would be an issue and why that's something that characters need to face and overcome. In the world of the Aspect, because I kind of decided at the very start that because magic has been around from the beginning, a lot of the sort of traditional power imbalances between men and women just didn't exist because there was no power imbalance in the way that magic was distributed between men and women. And so it made sense to me to not have any of that in the Aspect. And it felt right that there wouldn't be any of that. It didn't feel like I was kind of cheating anything or making life too easy or not being very representative, because the way the world is structured is very different to our world in the kind of social historical context of it. So there isn't really any sort of sexual harassment or anything like that in the world, or if there is, it's not gendered. It's kind of spread equally because there just isn't that sort of same power imbalance that there is in our world.
Yeah, I really like that aspect of the book, and Natalie's said what I think. I think Barnes' character arc was really beautiful in the way that she wasn't sexualized at all. It reminded me of the post that you put up on Instagram about J.V. Jones's series and how it was explored there versus a more modern series and the differences between the two, and that really made me think. So that's a cool insight to sort of have and bring into your own world. Now, going a little bit off topic and talking about your Instagram post, what a segue. I've seen some like forbidden or like occult texts on your Instagram, and I know the Aspect was sort of like rune like or pattern like in the structure. Were the occult texts inspiration for the magic
Yes.
system?
Yeah.
They were? Okay,
Yeah.
cool.
So I really like secrets. I really like learning secret things. So the idea of being able to read and find occult texts that 100 years ago you wouldn't have been allowed to read, or 200 years you weren't allowed to read, or you had to join a secret society to find. I find that really interesting, and a lot of this you can blame on Philip Pullman, because when I was a child I read his Dark Materials, and he kind of incepted me into being really interested into like esoteric Gnostic sects, which I didn't really understand as a child, and then when I went back and reread it as an adult, I was like, oh my god, this is what's to blame for me spending hours and hours like plumbing the
No, I've
depths of
not read it yet.
Wikipedia. Oh, you absolutely need to read it.
That's one.
There is one of my favorite series. But yeah, so specifically, the religion of the aspect intersects with the magic of the aspect, and one of the things I really like to do when I'm writing is to try and ground certain aspects with real life, real world things, so that especially when you're exploring the more harder to grasp kind of things, it's a bit easier for a reader to read it and go, okay, this makes logical sense, or okay, I can picture this. So with the religion, we have two countries that we're specifically focused on. We have Vinaruda and we have Kiseri. They both share the same religion, although the way that the Vinaruda see that religion is they see it purely from an atheist perspective, which sounds weird, but by atheist I mean lack of a god. So they don't see any sort of godhead in their religion. They see it more as like a spiritual religion, whereas the Kiseri, they do have a godhead. And then there, as we discover in the Soul's aspect, there are then sects within the Vinaruda country who have a kind of halfway house belief between what the Kiseri believe and what the Vinaruda believe. And so it allows the reader to read it, and they can understand how the religion has transpired over time. And it's a way, again, of providing history to the reader without doing an information dump. But a lot of that was inspired by, like I said, I'm really interested in Gnostic religion. So it was inspired by Gnostic tenets, and specifically within Christianity, there were a lot in the 16th, I think in the 15th to 17th century, there was a big movement across Europe with Gnosticism and Gnostic denominations of Christianity. And one of the ones I was really inspired by was there was a movement in France called the Cathars. I think that's how you pronounce them. You can roast me in the comments if that's not right. But have you ever heard of the phrase "kill them all and let God sort them out"?
Yes, I have.
That comes from the purging of the Cathars by Rome, by the Pope. So something that's really interesting is the way that agnostic, and I mean that not in the modern sense, in terms of like someone who doesn't believe in God but also doesn't really care. I mean that in the opposite of agnostic religion, which means they believe they don't think that they can know God. So kind of the true kind of Catholicism, how that intersects with an agnostic religion, which is people who believe they can know God, and the way to achieve enlightenment and true spiritual purity is to understand God. How they intersect and how they can fight against each other, and how even though they share so many of the same core beliefs, there's an absolute like kind of annihilation if you put the two together. And actually, the aspect as a magic system was inspired a lot by those kind of Gnostic beliefs, which is the core one being spiritual purity comes from knowing something and understanding something, and also kind of there's no true Godhead in the sense that there's one being. It's more that everything comes from one spiritual plane, and that spiritual plane makes up what they believe is to be God. And that is essentially what the aspect is, and the way that the magic system works. So there's a lot of various different things that went into it from that. Gnosticism and esotericism isn't that particularly well known these days, mostly due to those purges that happened. And it was kind of deemed as heresy, so it just doesn't really isn't that well known anymore. And then also, some more things that really heavily inspired the aspect. The Key of Solomon, which is the sigils. If you've seen any sort of kind of horror, like I think it's in a Hereditary, where they have a sigil for Paimon. So the Key of Solomon, these are sigils that were drawn supposedly by the King of Solomon, but they were popularized in, I think it was the 1930s, by our favorite occultist Aleister Crowley in the Ars Goetia. So those sigils and the idea of drawing those sigils to summon things, that fed into the aspect a little bit. But actually what happened more was John Dee's, which then became the more modern version of chaos magic, which is a real world belief system in that drawing sigils, drawing patterns from intent, you can get them to work as kind of services to work in the background to do things for you. So all of these things have kind of fed into the aspect. And then also, obviously, the book that you're talking about, which is a book on the Rosicrucians, which again, agnostic, esoteric offshoot of Christianity, which intersects with kind of Freemasons. And actually, if you tend to think about Freemasons, you're probably actually thinking about a sect of the Rosicrucians. So yeah, so long story short, I really enjoy learning about these sort of secret things. And then it's good, I think, to try and ground these more complex topics in books with real world things like this. And I think also kind of Christianity gets used quite a lot in fantasy stories as kind of like, here's my religion, it's a monodeity, and this is the structure, and it's very similar to Christianity. So I thought it'd be fun to do the same thing, but take it from sources that are like widely unknown from most people, as a way of grinding the religion and making it feel realistic in the way that people react with different tenets in it.
I love that we went from his dark materials straight to the occult and purging.
If you've read his Dark Materials, you'll know that is absolutely fine. I mean, a little bit of a sidetrack, but I didn't really realize until I read it, but his Dark Materials contains topics such as the demiurge, which is in Gnosticism, the demiurge is kind of like seen as like the false god that the Gnostics have to defeat in order to attain true spiritual enlightenment. Caveat here, I'm an atheist. I don't believe in any of this stuff. I approach it more as a scholar. Yeah, his Dark Materials, it's a great primer if you're really interested in esoteric beliefs. And I think Philip Pullman was also largely inspired by William Blake, the English poet, who also had esoteric kind of Gnostic beliefs as well. And again, a lot of William Blake's work was led to some inspiration for the aspect.
So you sort of answered it, but I'm going to pivot to a question that I had later, which is, do you remember a book from your childhood or adulthood that made you think that, yes, I can do this and I want to write? Was that his Dark Materials for you, or was it something else?
I think his Dark Materials was a big inspiration for the book, and there were a lot of inspirations for the book. I mean, the key inspirations for the Aspect series, his Dark Materials, from how he explored kind of spirituality, Name of the Wind, and Wisdom Sphere. Obviously, they are kind of into, if we think about modern fantasy in the last, I was about to say 10 years, it's depressive, it's not 10 years, in the last 20 years, they are like the defining coming of age, first person perspective fantasy stories. And, the prose in them are beautiful as well. But the way that, more specifically, Rothfuss approaches friendships in his books, I wanted to try and capture in my books as well, because I think it's really beautiful the way that he captures the relationships between Kavath, Sim, and Willem. And then obviously Robin Hobb's books, in the way that she writes realistic characters, and they're dark, but they are emotionally dark, as well as physically dark, but they are more emotionally dark than they are kind of grim dark, which I think is really great, and it's something I wanted to capture. And there are other sources of inspiration as well, such as The Shadow of What Was Left, and books like that. In terms of, was there a book I read that really made me feel like I could be a writer? The honest answer is not a good one. The answer is no, because I think I read those books and I was like, wow, that's amazing. I don't understand how they can do this. And I kind of just thought, yeah, it's not something that I could do myself, because it seemed like it was too, when you read a lot of fantasy books and you read a lot of like multiple perspective POV books, you're like, how on earth do they like come up with this to be able to like entwine all of these things together? And I think the more fantasy I read, and the more frequently I read fantasy, the more I was like, I'm never going to be able to write this. And actually, when I started writing The Soul's Aspect, it was because I hadn't read any fantasy in like 5 years, because I was in just like the world's biggest fantasy slump. And it was actually that got me to write in the first place. So it was the opposite. Reading books made me feel like I couldn't write, and then stop reading books gave me the confidence to write.
There's your inspiration, kids. If you want to write, stop reading.
Don't read.
Well, you have managed to get these 3 books out in a relatively short time frame. I think we've had one a year, I believe, sort of fairly close together. How have you found the world of indie storytelling?
So in terms of like the speed of writing, they're not that long books. You can see this is the hardback, so it looks a bit thicker, but they're only about 300 pages each, which is about 100,000 words. So 100,000 words. When I'm writing, I'm writing, I'm properly thinking about the start and the end of a book. It takes about, I can write on average about 1,500 words a day on weekdays, and then 3,000 words on weekends. So it's only about four months from start to finish for writing a book. And then when you take in breaks and stuff, it's more about five months. So, and then the editing process takes up the rest of the year. So it's not. I don't think I'm not writing particularly quickly. I could definitely be writing quicker, and there are indie fantasy authors I know that write a lot quicker. I think that specifically with indie fantasy storytelling, I think the challenge is the marketing is non-existent. You do all your own marketing, and so a lot of the best marketing that I can have is not paid marketing. It's the free marketing that I get from word of mouth from readers, because it's the most authentic, it's organic. But that only comes from releases, it's kickstarted by releases. And people read the books and they get really interested in the books, and then they talk about the books and post the books, and then you get the uptick from that. But if you stop publishing books and you take a break, you do just disappear very easily. And I was talking to an indie fantasy author who is pretty big. He's done very well. He's way bigger than I am. And he's basically said the same thing, that as soon as he took a break from writing, it kind of felt that like all momentum on his book kind of just stopped, which is tough. And I think that's one of the bigger issues with self-pub versus traditional pub, is that you don't have the machinery and the wheelhouse behind you to keep the progress going while you do take breaks. So I think it is more important to try and get books out quicker. The issue with that is obviously balancing the risk of burnout and quality at the same time. But I did know that I needed to do these. If I was going to write 3 books and that be like one volume, it definitely needed to be 1 book per year in order to keep up the momentum of the story.
Heather makes a really good point in the comments, because I'm exactly the same. Indie fantasy has topped the best reads of the year recently, but rarely the really hyped ones. So, as a reader, for me, I don't know if this is just me being cynical, but if a book gets too hyped and too picked up, I will put that to the bottom of the list. Like, I'm no longer interested in the thousands of people talking about this.
That's interesting. I think it's completely fair, because I can imagine. I will hold my hands up. I've got a collection of indie fantasy books behind me, which are my favorite ones. But
is that a King's Radiance behind you?
It is, and it's the only indie. It's the only book yet I haven't yet read, and I feel really terrible about it. But it came out just as I was writing the Soul's Instruments this time.
Come on, Mark. That second one's coming out in October. What are you doing?
It is, yeah. So I'm gonna read it before, or as the second one comes out, I think. But yeah, the first book came out while I was editing the second book, and then started writing Chaos Risen, and I can't read while I'm writing, so I've just not had a chance to read it yet. But yeah, sorry. Hyped indie fantasy book. I think so. I haven't read that many of the big indie fantasy books, which is really bad of me. I've not read Ryan Cahill stuff, and I've not read Illborn yet, and I've not read Ben Galley's work or anything like that.
I was trying to figure out what they were, Natalie, in the background.
Yeah, Greed and Envy. Yeah. So I haven't read them, so I can't really comment on them because I've not read them. But I would assume that one of the reasons why they do get so popular is that they will have a lot of things. There's a crossover between people who will only read traditional fantasy and those that will read indie fantasy. And I assume that the people who really enjoy indie fantasy read indie fantasy because they maybe they want to break from stuff that's going into traditional fantasy. So I do understand where that might come from, and I assume it comes from the crossover appeal of those books. I do get it.
I'm always like little guy myself, so I'll always like push trad pub or really high books for little guy who needs a bit of a step up, which leads me into marketing. As you were saying, as an indie author, all of that falls on you. You don't have the wheelhouse behind you to be able to push out the marketing aspects that are so important to getting your name out there. So, how have you pulled readers into your world? Do you use things like alphas and betas, ARC readers? How have you found the marketing aspect for yourself?
I found the marketing aspect awful. It's terrible. It's the worst part of this. And I think if you ask any author, they will say the exact same thing. The thing is when you are a debut author, you really need to have a footprint somewhere to begin with in order to be able to then convince people to read. I did the very smart thing of creating an author name and a brand new social media the month that I wanted to launch my book, which meant I had no footprint. I had no connections at all with anybody. And so I had to basically start from zero. And I launched the book in, I think it was, what year were we in? 2021 or 2020? I can't remember which year it was, but it was in August. And basically I had no movement for the next 6 months because it was 6 months trying to build a footprint on social media. I don't pay for, well, my ethos with all of this is to not put any money in that I'm willing to lose. So I don't pay anything for marketing because I kind of know that the only way to make a return on marketing is you actually have to put quite a lot of money into adverts, for example. And at the moment, I've got other things I need to pay for, so I'm not willing to lose that much money. And to be honest, organically, the sales do kind of all right. It's not self-sustaining or anything like that, but it does okay. The marketing that I rely on is, as I said, organic, and it's driven from the readers. And personally, I like that. I like that the way that people will hear about the books is that they will be recommended them from Instagram posts or from Twitter posts. So I approached it. I basically, for marketing, I kind of said to myself, right, I'm going to pick one social media platform, and I'm just going to try and develop a footprint on there. And then from there, I will talk to people and see if I can find people who will be interested in my books. So I started off on Instagram because that felt like a more easily accessible social media platform for me to use. I do photography as well, so there's a nice crossover there. And then what I did, I found readers who enjoyed books that were inspired the Souls Aspects. I was like, oh, hey, you really enjoyed Robin Hood. There's a possibility, a slim possibility, but there's a possibility that you might enjoy the Souls Aspects. Can I send you a copy and you tell me what you think? And so it kind of went from there of me sending out books to people that I thought would enjoy it. And then what happened was there were kind of a core group of people, yourself included, who seemed to really enjoy the book, who then did a lot of the promotion for me. They talked about the book and they talked about it on Instagram. And then, Instagram's great because then you can, as an author, you can then reshare those things very easily to make it more visible. And then from that, it kind of snowballed into what it is now. From that core group of people, many of the names I can see in the chat today, which just goes to show how enthusiastic these people are.
All the loyalists. We're all here.
Exactly, yeah. I mean, they've called themselves the Court of Chaos now, so there's even like a group name for them, which is just wonderful.
Amazing.
Exactly. So in terms of like the actual like nitty gritty in terms of ARC readers, alpha betas, I had alpha and beta readers for the Souls Aspect. I was in a writing group when I was writing the Souls Aspect. So a lot of the alpha reading was done in that writing group. My wife does all my beta reading for me, which she's incredibly well read. She doesn't read that much fantasy. She reads more classics and genre fiction, but has actually been reading more and more fantasy recently. And she's actually currently reading Lies of Lamora as we speak, which is one of my favorite books. But the reason I give it to her because out of everybody that's read my books, and even the people that have given me like 1 stars, she is my worst critic, and she will tell me in the most brutal terms when something isn't or is working. So for story beats and making sure I have the story correct and that everything feels correct and earned when things happen, I trust my wife to read through that book and let me know what is or isn't working. And then I have ARC readers who are basically those group of core people that first loved the book that I know really enjoyed the Souls Aspect, and they're great as ARC readers because the series has changed so much since the first book. I need to know that I am staying true to what people really enjoyed in the first book. So those sticking with those kind of core group of the ARC readers, and bringing in a couple of people who came, I know really enjoyed the Souls Instruments into the ARC for Chaos Risen, for example, was a good way of making sure that Chaos Risen was going to appeal to both types of readers, because there are definitely two types of readers. Of the people who really enjoyed the first half of the Souls aspects, where it's super cozy and that kind of vibe, and then there are people that really enjoyed the more darker aspects. So trying to balance the readership of both is super important. I don't do public betas or go out to people outside of my wife for beta reading, mostly because, and I don't do alpha reads either for Instruments or Chaos Risen, mostly because I know what the story needs to be, and I know what needs to happen in those books. And for me, I don't alpha reading and public betas like that are more for getting the story elements correct, and I don't want to change those. That's me being the author and saying I don't want to change those. So I didn't feel like I wanted to go for those books. Although if I start a new series, I'll probably go back to a public beta again, just to make sure that if a brand new book, if it's working or not, if it makes sense.
I think it's one of the joys and the real benefits of indie publishing is that you get to make those decisions for yourself. So if you don't want to change anything, you don't have to as the author, which is such a powerful part of that process for you as the author.
Yeah.
It's always funny when, to me, my wife is a copy editor and a line editor. So when you hear other people with dynamics like that, I just remember all of my university assignments got shat on during my uni career, having an editor for a wife. And now that I'm like also dabbling in writing myself, I'm so scared to give her the book at the end of the day. But you know what? It will be what it will be. So yes, they can be. And it's amazing to have that support within your own sort of a household as well. So Mark, a question that I do have to ask all authors that come on the channel: plotter or panster? Plotter or panzer, whatever you call it.
I'm both.
Okay.
When I mean I'm both, I don't mean that I'm a plantster or something in between. I mean that I've basically done all three. The Souls aspect was written in a true pantser fashion, where I had a start and an end goal, and I kind of just wrote and I explored. I think that's kind of led to it being quite very heavily character driven as well. Is that as I was writing, I explored the characters with writing, and I knew kind of what was happening in each arc, but it wasn't really planned out, and I just kind of wrote. The downside to that is that I wrote an awful lot, which then had to be deleted and started again. I think the book is 109,000 words. I think if I include all the bits that I had deleted, it was probably closer to 200,000. So that's the downside.
A fair chunk.
Yeah, exactly. But that's kind of the natural flow I think I found with writing like a pantser, which is just you write to explore, and then you end up writing yourself in a hole, or you discover that you've changed your mind about a certain plot element, and then so the last 20,000 words don't make sense anymore, and you have to go back and restart. The Souls Instrument was kind of written like that as well. It was a little bit more structured, hence why I'd say it was more of in between the plantser way of writing, where again it was more heavily leaning towards pantser, where I had start and end, but maybe it was a little bit more structured, and I'd have notes about, okay, this happens at this point, this happens at this point. Mostly because having two POVs, I found it a lot harder to kind of write by the seat of my from the edge of the seat, kind of off the cuff. So it needed to be a little bit more structured. And then Chaos Risen, I wrote the first act the same way I'd always done, and then I had to take a break from writing because I was changing my job, and I had to focus on my day job for a little bit. And I came back to it, and I was like, this is hot garbage. This is just terrible. So I deleted all 40,000 words of it and started again. And what I found was, with this third book, because a lot of things from the previous books had to pull together into a conclusive ending, and there are more POVs in this book. There are 3 POVs in the third book, 2 of them brand new. It was really hard to write off the cuff with that kind of general style of writing. and make it feel cohesive. And so I went full planner mode and had a spreadsheet, and I broke all of my chapters down into scenes. Each scene had a target word count, and then I could just go through and cross each scene off as they were written. And that I was finding really hard to motivate myself to write Chaos Risen, just because it was so complicated from pulling the threads together. And if you've read Chaos Risen, you would also know as well that there's narrative elements in there which are unusual, which were very hard to write. It wasn't as free flowing as the other two books were. So planning it out entirely was the way to go. So I've done all three. If I was to start again, I would probably stay with the planner mode, but it depends on the story. Short stories, completely off the cuff. Novellas, probably off the cuff. Another full length novel, especially with multiple POVs, I will probably just go back to fully planning it out. Because it was just easier, which is a surprise to me, because I thought I was a true pantser, but obviously not.
It's always fun asking those questions. So, as an author, you were talking about 1,500 words a day on weekdays and 3,000 on the weekends. It's quite a structure that you have there. How do you get your creative juices flowing? Do you set yourself that routine? You say, I need to do that each day, or do you give yourself a bit of leeway?
If I know I'm writing a book and I want to get the book finished, I will set myself a target. I won't set myself a word count, but I'll say you need to sit down for at least an hour today and sit down and write. It doesn't have to be. And what I used to do is I used to write and then I used to go back and edit, which is a terrible way of writing. Don't ever do that. But these days I kind of go, all right, I'm just going to write. It doesn't matter if it's terrible. I'm just going to put words on paper, because coming back to it and editing it, so 3 months down the line, it's a lot easier to edit something than it is to create something brand new. So I will tell myself, you have an hour each day that you need to write for. And it just worked out for me that an hour of writing equates to about 1,500 words. In terms of creative juices, I think when I'm writing, I will try and pin certain non-writing media down into the work. So I'll go out and take photos, and I'll say, well, this photo is really good. I want to try and capture what this photo looks like, but in words, and capture it within a scene, which happened a lot in the Souls Aspect, which was written during the pandemic, where I could go out for walks and nothing else. So I go out, take a photo of a forest, and I go, right, this is the forest I want to be in a scene. How do I translate this picture into writing and capture it in the scene? But I also do the same with music. At the moment I'm listening to an album that I'm really enjoying, and it makes me feel a certain way. I feel like there's a color associated with this, and I can see myself in a certain manor house, and there's a melancholy to it. So trying to, when you listen to something, you get those kind of feelings, and then trying to pin that into writing and translate what you're feeling internally into writing I think is a good way of trying to capture it. And actually, if you read any of my books, there are certain scenes where I've kind of gone, right, this is the feeling, and I'm anchoring it into this section. So in the Souls Aspect, there's a chapter called Home with a Heretic, which is exactly that. There was a feeling of trying to be in an abandoned house, which I was like, right, I want to capture everything that this feels like, and this is the chapter to do it. In the Souls Aspect, there's kind of a lot of melancholy chapters where he's walking through the Azale Academy at night, and it's kind of late summer, and you've got that kind of, it's cool, but it's been hot during the day, and trying to capture that feeling in there. So again, it's ways of trying to capture that. But the thing that I find really helpful when I am writing, and I'm writing a lot in the evening, just as I'm about to go to sleep, I kind of let my mind drift a little bit, and I think about the books, and just in that kind of halfway house between being awake and sleeping, it's almost essentially liminal dreaming, where I'm thinking about the story, but I'm not really focused on what I want the story to be. It's more just kind of, it's coming to me almost in a dream. And so there's loads of different possibilities of where a scene could go, because I'm not really focusing it consciously, it's more subconsciously. And then that then feeds into the scene that I'm about to write the next day, which is it's been very helpful for me. And it's one of the benefits of writing each day, is that you get, you build up the story like that, and you can kind of, I found that I can kind of let myself slip into that kind of semi-conscious state to kind of hallucinate what the next scene is going to be.
Have you ever done one of those magnesium salt bath floats before? This is all off the cuff, but I found that those things So it's a place in Australia that's called City Cave, and basically it's this really dark room. It's all about sensory deprivation. You take away your senses essentially, and you get into this bath that has like 400 kilos of salt in it. So your body naturally floats on the water, and you turn off the music, you turn off the lights. It's complete and utter darkness in there. You can't hear anything. And I found that things like that are akin to that dream state where you're sort of not
Mm.
conscious at all. Or you are conscious, but you're not. Your mind is very much drifting away. And like that's where a lot of my own ideas have come from. It's just in this state of nothingness. So I think it's really cool to talk about that in the dream sense, where you're sort of between those levels of consciousness and have that just let your brain go wild and do what it needs to do.
That's really interesting. I don't think we've got anything like that in the UK. Maybe I could just buy a bag of like de-icing salt and just chuck it in the bath.
I once took a bath in Himalayan sea salt out of desperation, and it was not good. The amount of scratches on my butt, just don't do it. I don't recommend it to
Okay.
you.
All right. Fair point.
So, coming to sort of the end now, the aspect is done for now, but not forever. Is that correct?
Yeah. So no, not forever. So the series is split up into volumes. So the first volume is done. But if you read Chaos Risen, you'll know that there are plot points that are still open that need to be resolved. There are character arcs which are still open that need to be resolved. So there will be a second volume. The reason why it's split into volumes is that it's split into like the major arcs. So Souls Aspect Volume 1 focuses on kind of two very particular arc points which are closed out within this volume. But the second volume will pick up from characters, but we'll also have new characters. There'll be a new overall plot arc for the second volume. What I can't say is how long those volumes will be. The first series felt like a trilogy. The next volume, it doesn't feel like a trilogy. It feels more like a duology, but I'm not certain yet. And until I kind of finish plotting it all out, I can't really say. But there is already, I've already got the first book planned out. And I probably won't know exactly what's happening if the second book needs to split into another two, so it's a full trilogy or not. And I also don't know yet if there'll be a third volume. So it could be that there's a second volume and that's it, or it could be there's a third volume that goes on after that. It really depends on the characters that get brought into the new volume, and if I feel like they have character arcs that need to continue, or if there's plot elements that need to continue. I also have a novella planned at some point, which will be a prequel to the Souls Aspect, and will feature some of the characters that featured in Chaos Risen, and explain some of their motivations that appear during Chaos Risen. When that gets written, I'm not certain yet. I would love to start writing it now, but I have also got another series that I want to start writing, which is completely separate to the Souls Aspect, which is going to be written before at least the next book in Volume 2 comes out. So whether or not there's a prequel that will come out, or there'll be this new book will come out first, I'm not sure. It just depends on what I feel about writing first. So.
Hella says non-trilogies is so good. I love prequel novellas. I too love prequel novellas. They are some of my favorite things to come out of fantasy because you get that little bit of insight into the wider world. So I agree, and I think that I mean, to me, I love trilogies. I'm a big trilogy guy because I think they're clean. They're neat.
Mm-hmm.
You've got enough to explore, but it comes in a little package, which I enjoy. But yes, now that I'm a bit more read in fantasy, I do agree. So so you sort of alluded to working on something else as well. Can you tell us anything about it yet, or are we?
Yeah, I can tell you about it because it's probably going to be at least a year till it comes out, so you can learn about it, and then you'll probably all forget about it by the time it comes out. So this book series, again, not certain yet if it's a duology or if it's standalone. I would prefer for it to be standalone because the same way that people love non-trilogies and love prequels, I think standalones are sorely lacking in fantasy, and we all kind of want to write too much. So I'd love to write a single standalone book with an arc that's kind of finished in one book, but it might end up being a duology. I don't want to force it to be standalone if it doesn't feel like it should be. But the book is at the moment is going to feature twin narratives. One POV is a woman who is on the hunt to kill God, which is a broad statement.
I'm in. I'm already in.
Yeah. And another character is a young girl who was birthed in extremely complicated scenarios, and she's on a quest to understand herself. The setting is kind of a little bit like a fifth season, in that we focus a little bit on precursor civilizations with ancient technology. In that sense, but it's a very traditional kind of fantasy setting, and where it differs from the Aspect is that it will be unrelentingly dark, a dark fantasy. It will be a lot darker than the previous fantasy books that I've written have been. Chaos Risen is probably similar kind of levels, although it will be a bit more leaning towards grimdark, but not necessarily grimdark itself. So it will feature twin narratives, and essentially the major plot elements of the story are around religion and hunting and trying to kill God, and the repercussions that come with that, and the way that magic intersects with spirituality. Some of the ways similar to the ways it's explored in the Souls Aspect, but from a completely different perspective. And will feature such magic things that I really enjoy, such as necromancy. Which is a type of fantasy magic which I feel like doesn't get explored enough. So necromancy, dead god, twin narratives, both female perspectives, and the narratives will intersect as well as the story goes on. Not certain yet if it's a duology or a standalone, but when I write it, I'll find out.
It all sounds amazing. Hello, Richard. Welcome in for the last few minutes. It's good that you're here. I appreciate you being here. Look, I know you said you were more open to betas on the new ones, and just hit me up anytime. Yeah. It's fine.
Absolutely. Yeah.
I'll drop everything to be able to do it. All right. Before we close off, Mark, I'm going to get you to hold up those 3 books to the camera, if you can. The ones behind you for the Aspect. So we've got the Souls Aspect, the Souls Instrument, and Chaos Risen. These are books 1, 2, and 3 in the Aspect. Volume number 1. And they're also beautiful and vibrant as well, which draws the eye to the cover.
Okay. You can kind of see them all lined up. I shouldn't have picked hardbacks because they're too heavy, too awkward to try it all together.
That is amazing. Well, anyone who is curious about it and hasn't read Mark's works yet, do check out the description box down below. There is links to his website and also all 3 books, should you want to jump in and read the Aspect, which you really should, in my humble opinion. And I'm sure also, Mark's humble opinion there in the background.
I think you should.
Pretty good series. So that is it from us. Thank you so much, Mark, for joining me here today and giving us some of your time on your lovely Sunday morning. It's been a great interview and great to have you here on the channel.
Thanks very much for having me, Chris, and thank you for all your support with these books. It's invaluable, genuinely.
Anytime. And what was the cult called?
The Cult of Chaos. Yeah, you're welcome. The Cult of Chaos. We need to get pins. We need to get some robes. We need to have some meetings, I think.
Well, the Cult of Chaos, who has joined us in the comments, thank you so much for being here. I'm jealous and I'm not part of it, and I'm going to
the cult can always grow.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you. Thank you very much. We'll sign off there, and I will catch everyone in the next video.